Hey everybody, welcome today. We'd like for you to go ahead and make sure everything is set up on your audio device, and we will be getting started momentarily. And as we're sitting there waiting to get started, go ahead and feel free to bookmark our site for the LionSide chats, so you can check out some of our former chats and some of our upcoming chats as well. And if you have any questions, you can always reach us at berkslschats@psu.edu. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to the Penn State Berks LionSide Chat. Come on in and welcome to our campus. We're so glad that you could join us. My name is Sonia Delacueto, and I'm one of 3 LionSide Chat moderators working alongside Professor Dawn Pfeiffer-Wright and Dr. Ryan Hassler. Before we get started, we wanted to share that you should please feel free to submit questions throughout the program via the Q&A feature. We will not be utilizing the raising hand feature today, though. Once the presentation concludes, we're going to facilitate a discussion with our panelists, and we'll also be recording today's session so you can revisit the topic or even share the experience with friends and family. That being said, we would, and we're very excited to introduce Professor Tara Beecham, who is going to help us learn how to spring into freelance writing and share tips for beginners who are new to the field. Professor Beecham, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sonia.
We are very excited to learn, and I'm going to hand over the show to you.
Okay, well, I'm going to share my screen just briefly. Now, spring officially starts tomorrow, right? I can't believe it. I mean, it just sort of creeped up on me. I was shocked. And in sports, this is a really important season. Spring training is a time when people build stronger skills. So today we're going to think about how to strengthen our skills for freelance writing. If you're remotely thinking about freelance writing as an undergraduate, we're going to go over some tips today, and hopefully this will help you as we begin and discuss just some things that are going on in the world as far as freelancing and some best practices. So once in a while, freelance writing, it can seem overwhelming at first, but this is a time when there's very little risk, and it's a great time to start thinking about this as a process. Now, I began freelance writing as an undergraduate, and I tried to gain experience through internships and writing for internal publications. So my first freelance gig was actually at my internship. It wasn't a guarantee that my work would be published. I worked really hard to get a good internship. I ended up interning for Pittsburgh Magazine, right above Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. It's kind of funny, right above like the actual neighborhood itself. I saw the tree where Daniel Striped Tiger lived, and I met Mr. Rogers in an elevator. It was pretty fascinating. But I would research stories. Part of my job was to research stories that people had written for the magazine, make sure what was written there was correct and true. And as that happened, I would come up with ideas for stories and try to pitch them to the editors. And sometimes the editors would say, you know what, in our briefs section, would you be interested in writing about this there? And I was thrilled. I thought, oh my goodness, I had no idea that I'd be able to do this and get paid for it, because I love to write. It was something that I enjoyed doing. And I would write a small, maybe 3-paragraph little brief that would appear with my name next to it in the front of the magazine. It was a commercial glossy magazine sold on newsstands, kind of like Philadelphia Magazine, but for Pittsburgh. And it gave me confidence. And that's one of the things as an undergraduate you want to gain in selling your work. That's just an example. There's so many paths to freelance writing. And today I'm just talking about a few that have worked for me that I hope will work for you. So if you have an internship planned, or if you're thinking about an internship, this is a really great time to sort of develop relationships with the editors at these publications and let them know that you're interested in writing for them, and where in the magazine or newspaper or website and how. Okay. Another thing that I thought about, I wrote for my school paper. I wrote for the Pitt News, and I covered theater. I was a theater critic, and I wrote theater features. I was a terrible theater critic because I hated to say things that were negative. My editor would always say, give me some conflict, give me some conflict. And it's hard. You don't want, as an undergraduate, you don't want to necessarily say anything negative, a lot of negatives about a performance. I mean, occasionally some were really bad that I saw. I saw a lot of theater as an undergraduate. And I had an interest in the arts. I had an interest in that field. I had been in dance for years. I loved to write. I liked poetry. And I, went to a lot of theater shows, reviewed them, previewed them, and I wrote features about the people involved with them. I learned different techniques along the way. Now, there are opportunities to do that in a creative magazine for school. And you could try to pitch for other papers within, your school, like the Collegian, which isn't a Penn State Berks publication, but you could always try to pitch a story there as well. And I thought about writing a scholarship section for the school handbook. Now, that's kind of out of the norm. We know as an undergraduate, we try to, write internally, but I thought, that's what's missing. There's scholarships out there, but nobody knows about them. Students didn't have one place to go to learn what kind of scholarships were available to them, or they weren't being publicized enough by the different departments at my school. And there wasn't a lot of an in-depth website. They had a website, but it was many years ago. And it was sort of the internet was just sort of catching on in the 1990s. And so I said, I would like to compile something for a student handbook. And that was a clip. And you wouldn't necessarily think you would put something like that on your resume. I had hoped to do an entire booklet on its own, like an actual publication on its own, and distribute it. But it made more sense because of the length and the response that I got going through the spreadsheets to make it a section of the student handbook. And they were open to that. So it worked pretty well. And so I could put that on my resume. Now, some of you might apply to grad schools, and this can help. This can help build your portfolio. Another thing that I did to seek undergraduate freelance work, because I'd caught that bug working for my internship. I wanted to get published. I like to be paid for the work that I put into it. Obviously, it's like another job. I sought work by pitching stories to an alternative newspaper in my city. So that's a free publication. And we have them around here in Berks County. It was a little edgier, this one. It was a little more closer to the Village Voice, but it was for Pittsburgh. They had a lot of cultural commentary. They had a lot of previews of different festivals going on in the city and different events. And because I had clips for writing, theater profiles and theater reviews, I started out in that section. I thought I will pitch an idea to them and say, hey, there's this new company coming in. I'd love to cover this particular event. Would you be interested in me writing a brief review or preview? I would say review or preview for this section. And they weren't all accepted, but then eventually they were. And they said, yeah, we would like you to write that, send it to us at this page length for this amount of money. Here's a contract, sign it. You'll get first North American rights to it. And then you would submit it and it would be published. And that was wonderful. I was so happy. That was, again, another area to gain confidence as a writer. And when I was working for them, one of the things that I thought, I want to write more. I want to do a feature story. I don't want to just be limited to little briefs. I only have a certain amount of time that I'm in college to take advantage of this. And I pitched an idea to them for a piece about the Shakespeare Festival. The Three Rivers Shakespeare Festival happens every year. I knew they'd be covering it. And I looked at it and I really put a lot of thought into how could I pitch something that's original to them that they haven't seen 100 times before? What would set my work apart? And I thought the costumes were unique. I thought I could go and talk to people at the festival and learn a little bit about what goes into creating costumes for it, because it was unique in the sense that sometimes they would take Shakespearean plays, but set them in the 1930s, or they might do a deconstructed version of Romeo and Juliet, which they did one year, where people were partially dressed like Tudor times and partially modern dress. So it was a little bit different. And they said, yeah, you know what? That's a good idea. We want 2,000 words. We'll give you a shot. we need it by this date, and here's what we'll pay you if it gets picked up. And I thought, okay, this is my big chance. I immersed myself in learning more about costumes. I'd go to the rehearsal studio. I set up an interview with a couple people that were involved in the costumes. I tried to take in the sensory details of the different fabrics, the different colors, the different moods they were trying to set. And I submitted this all in my story. And it took about a month to compile all the interviews and get all the information I needed. Turned in the story, and it ended up running on the cover. And I was thrilled because, again, this gives you confidence. You can, every clip that you gain goes in your portfolio for either your career or for grad school. And it shows that other people have confidence in your work. So gradually building a set of clips, they call them, these little stories are called clips, that will help you as an undergraduate. And those are some of the paths that I took to get it. Now, why freelance as an undergraduate? It's low risk. No one expects you to get your work published. You know, you have to hustle. You have to show some initiative. People don't just hand you work. I think that's something that needs to be said. You would need to put yourself in situations where the opportunity presents itself, either by an internship or through a query letter, which is like a job application letter in a sense, if you've done them for other classes that you've attended. It is low risk because if you get picked up, that's high reward. That's a great thing. But no one expects you to have published clips by that stage. Well, another thing this can do is why it's great to freelance as an undergraduate is because it helps you find your niche. And we all know that we have certain interests. Like I like the arts at that time, and I still do. And we're always told in school to be a Renaissance writer, learn different genres, learn different techniques. You can learn that through doing. You know, when we practice pitching our stories to different publications, it can help us narrow down in our mind, okay, I really liked learning more about that subject, and I really liked writing in that way, as opposed to this story when I had to do this. And it helps you find your interest and narrow them down. And that can help you as you look for a career that you can do as a professional writer that interests you. And again, I'll keep saying this, you know, it helps you build your portfolio. You need work to get work at many times in this field. It's almost like a catch-22. And you really want to make sure that you do your best to try to gain some clips to put into your portfolio. Part of this is learning where to look for ideas, right? When you're thinking about freelancing for the first time, okay, maybe you're thinking, I'd like to try this. This is something I would like to do, but I don't know where to look for ideas. Look through current newspapers, magazines, websites, listen to podcasts. This seems like a given, right? If you want to write, you need to read. You need to look at these different sites and figure out what is a common thread that keeps coming up. What is a popular topic in conversation? And what do I want to know more about in terms of that topic? What hasn't been covered yet? Consider both trade and commercial markets. So a commercial magazine, I'm just picking on magazine a little bit today because that's my field. I had written for magazines. I've written for newspapers, both in Western Pennsylvania, in Northeastern Pennsylvania, and in the suburbs of Chicago. I've also written for international news wires like Bloomberg News, and I was based in their Princeton office when I did that. But I also had work published in magazines before I went into freelancing on my own. I freelanced for more than a decade after school, and I did it off and on when I was in other positions. So when I speak of commercial magazines, getting back on track, Pittsburgh Magazine was a commercial magazine. Time Magazine is a commercial magazine. Sports Illustrated, Consumer Reports, they're commercial magazines because advertisers pay to have ads placed in them, and they're sold commercially to the public with the copy that the writers and the editors produce. So those are what we look for as far as commercial markets. And that's what people look at and say, I want to write for them. I want to write for that publication. I think I should just jump right into them right out of school or while I'm still in school. And it's possible, but it's very hard to break in initially without some clips. Trade publications are more industry specific. So if you have an interest in stamp collecting, if you like a specific sport, if you're a drummer, if you are interested in a wide variety of environmental magazines or interests, that can be, there's probably a trade magazine out there for it. I know there's some out for people that create their own jewelry. They're out there for people that are genealogists. One trade magazine that I've written for a few, is Erosion Control magazine. And I really didn't have a lot of experience with erosion control. And I thought that's really specific. But my husband was an environmental engineer at the time. He worked in the environmental pollution control industry. And I'd hear him talk about it at the dinner table. And I thought, man, I could research that. I could learn more about that. And there's this magazine that's looking for writers. I could write a few articles for that. And I sent a query letter for an article, and they didn't like the article that I had pitched, but they had one for me. They're like, but we do need someone to write this. And based on your experience, we would like to see what you can do. So they hired me. They sent me a contract for that story. They're usually single story contracts. And I would have to do about 17 interviews for a single story. And it would be several thousand words. I think they're like 7,000 word, 8,000 word stories. So they'd give me a month or two to complete it. And then I would submit it, and it was published. So I was grateful for that. The reason people go to trade magazines is they do pay well, and they do take risks. They could be the bread and butter of your freelance business. So when you begin freelancing, you wouldn't just start, you might start out with a story or two here and there. But as you build credentials as a freelance writer, you'll have multiple stories going on at the same time. And this can be challenging as an undergraduate, but if you end up doing this after you graduate, it's something to consider, that you might have one story that's due in 2 months and 3 stories that are due in a single week. It depends. It depends on the length of the story and what you can handle. And you'll learn that as you freelance more often. Don't be afraid to create your own opportunities. And this is something that people sometimes overlook. Well, I don't see anything anywhere that I can fit in. Here's an example. When I left Bloomberg News, my husband's job changed, and we moved to Westchester area in Pennsylvania to sort of be closer to our family. It wasn't right near our family, but it was fairly closer after our daughter was born. I was on maternity leave. And they were wonderful at Bloomberg. They're a great place to work. It would have been really hard to try to raise a family on that schedule. It was a very hectic, very intense schedule. I worked with a lot of single people, and they just lived it. It was just their life to pitch, write, and produce these stories on continuous deadlines. So I asked them, I'm like, I'd still love to write for you. Can I write on a freelance basis? That's one way you can try to work with your internship as an undergraduate. When you leave, you could say, can I try to work with you on a freelance basis? Occasionally that works. It didn't work in my instance because they were not allowing freelancers at that time. They had wanted you to be based within their network, sort of like the Associated Press. But I went to a local newspaper, the Daily Local News. I tried to think about what did I have that I could offer them that was unique. And my daughter was very young. And I said, I have an idea for a column. It's not out there yet, but I noticed, you have columnists. What would you think of a column called Rock the Cradle, where I would come up with an idea about something that week that I was thinking about that I came across with my daughter, an experience that I had with my own young infant daughter. And I would talk to a local expert or experts and see how to solve it or what advice they had for parents in our area. And I thought that, people give new parents advice all the time. It's just something you're overwhelmed with, you're inundated with. And I thought, why wouldn't we look for advice from people that, are experts in the field? And they liked the idea. And they gave me a biweekly column, and it continued for 6 years. So even if you have an idea for something that's not out there yet. Your youth may be a selling point. Your experiences may be a selling point depending on what's going on in your life at that time. Think about what you can bring to the company that you want to work for and try pitching it. Again, there's very little to lose. You are not going to look bad if your work doesn't get picked up the first time that you try to sell it. And another experience that is good for young freelance writers, think about how you can make the global local. So take a minute and take a look at your phone or your computer. And I'd like you to go to the New York Times website. And there are stories there, and think about, of those stories, how could you take one of those ideas and make it local? What could you do to pitch a story that would be based in Berks County for a Berks County paper or publication? How could I take a larger idea there and make it local? And write your thoughts for that, how to do that in the chat. And I'll just give you a minute to take a look at it. And I'll look at it too. And this exercise might help you sort of think about how you can do that with other features. Some of the headlines that I'm looking at say the US rushes to expand vaccine eligibility in a race against time. Europe lifts vaccine suspension as virus surge brings new lockdowns. How racism and sexism intertwine to torment Asian American women. Okay, we've got one comment in the chat. Okay, here's one. How are spa owners in Berks County reacting to the Georgia shootings? Excellent. That's exactly what we're looking for. So you can think about freelance writing. You think about what you can look at that's going on in the current conversation and how to make that local. So that's perfect. You might talk to local spa owners in Berks County and see how they react to it. Those are reaction pieces and they usually sell very well. Very good. So again, vaccine distribution is very hot right now. That's another opportunity for you to talk to different larger places that are being considered for distributors. Berks County right now doesn't have a health department. How is that impacting our access to vaccines? Some of that comes up in some of the local stories, but maybe you can think about someone unique to ask about that kind of information to pitch a story. So that's one way to make the global local. Another way to look for ideas that will sell as an undergraduate is to go to Editorial Calendars. And here's an example. An editorial calendar is simply a place on a website, usually in a media kit, but not exclusively in a media kit. Sometimes there are separate links where you can find whether it's a web publication or a news publication, as far as a newspaper that's print, or another type of portal site like a news wire. They almost all have a website that you can access, even if it's limited. Their media kit will almost always be accessible because they want to try to sell advertising. Now, editorial calendars are calendars of what the publication typically runs at what month and what day. So if they have a specific issue that always appears in June, like a gear guide or a summer, summers at the Jersey Beach, the beach guide. I think Philadelphia Magazine always runs specials about best of issue. They have a best of issue right around a particular time of years, or best doctors on the main line, things like that. So every year, their customers, their subscribers expect that to come. When we look at editorial calendars, we look to see what we can pitch going forward. So if I were trying to sell a story to a publication, I wouldn't necessarily try to sell it in the last minute. And I certainly wouldn't try to sell it even within a month or two. I would look ahead and think of, I have a story that I would like to do I was thinking about writing In magazine, it works a few months ahead. Now, sometimes with different websites, it could be instant. They could have ongoing things, but typically with editorial calendars, you want to learn what the publication is looking for and when it could potentially run, because that will help shape how you pitch your article to that publication. For example, Outside Magazine is a magazine that I used to research for years ago, and they have a really nice link on their website to their editorial calendar and information about how to send a query letter. And here we can see Outside publishes stories about adventure sports, gear, travel, fitness, health, culture, and the environment. And they're specifically telling you what they're looking for. Because outdoor adventure writing has historically highlighted predominantly white male voices and subjects, we are interested in women, BIPOC, LGBT+, and other diverse voices and subjects. Find more information here, and they have a hyperlink about the stories that they're looking for specifically and how to pitch them. And that's something that as a freelancer, you need to know. It's something that would be inside information. Okay, well, I know the idea that I had wouldn't work for March, but it might really sell for September. So I would want to pitch it early to see if they would be interested when they're assigning those stories. So that's something to keep in mind. Editorial calendars can be incredibly helpful. Now, there are many websites out there, and it's going to be specific to your interests as to where you look, like mediabistro.com, journalismjobs.com. It depends what you're interested in. But you may not know as an undergraduate where you can sell your work, or maybe how to narrow your interests down. Consider first your interest and your strengths. And then one way to research it as an undergraduate that I found helpful was The Writer's Market. It's a book, it's about this thick, and you can borrow it from your local library. It's okay if it's a back issue like 2020 and we're in 2021. Go to the most recent Writer's Market issue you can find at your local library or online. They have an online edition. They are for sale. I mean, you could certainly buy one from any major retailer or even local bookstore. It's a very well-known publication done by Writer's Digest, which is also a magazine. The Writer's Market can help you because it helps you find the following information that you might want to know when you're creating your story pitch ideas. It has a list of publications and websites for those publications. It has phone numbers and contact information for people at those particular publications. Sections of this Writer's Market book show, and it's also a site, show where freelance work is typically used in those publications. Because you wouldn't just say, hey, I'm interested in writing a story for your magazine, or again, I'm picking on magazine. You would tell them what section and how many words you'd want to write for them, how long the story that you're thinking about would be. You want to certainly tailor your pitches to areas of the publication that, writers might find, or the editors might find, your work matches well with. What is the average pay for a freelance article at these publications, and what is expected? Now, if you're just starting out as an undergraduate, you'll probably be on the lower end of the scale, but it's good to know what to ask for if they say, what are you? Sometimes they'll just tell you, this is what we pay our freelancers. Most of the time, that's what they will say. But certainly, if you're asked, if you end up talking to the person on the phone, it's important to know how much they're willing, what is the going rate for that kind of work and what that publication typically pays for that material. Another thing that I found invaluable when I didn't have a lot of experience was in the Writer's Market, they have sample query letters at the beginning and advice from writers and from editors, which I think is helpful because it's important to think about your audience. I'm sure your writing teachers have told you, think about your audience, think about your purpose. And this is a good way to gauge that. Now, I've drawn here a very rough outline for a stars have aligned timeline of an online magazine feature story. So this would appear on a website, on a magazine website. And this is assuming the best practices, best case scenario. You have an idea. and you found it, maybe you were looking through Writer's Digest, maybe you had an idea that came up at your internship, and you go through back issues of that publication or that website and see if the publication has written about that idea before. If it's a common topic and if you have a new spin for it, consider how to make it recent, how to make it local to that publication, or how to make it novel. What makes it unique? Why would we want to hear about it again? Does it address something that maybe other articles have not been addressing recently? Then search the market. This can be done in any number of ways, looking at those editorial calendars I talked about, looking at the writer's market for different publications you may not have considered. And think about, how to tailor your pitch. How are you going to tailor your application letter for this particular article? Then you pitch the story. Like in spring training, you're pitching that story, you keep trying. It usually takes the form of a print or electronic query letter in which you sell your idea to the editor. That hook would come early on. You would mention some basics about the story. And again, then close with what section it would be, considered for. Then again, this is stars aligned. The editor says, what a great idea. The story is accepted. You're contacted by the editor and often sent guidelines for the writing for their publication, parameters, length, maybe expectations for the piece. They usually want you to write in the voice or a similar voice to the tone that their publication runs material in. They will also expect you to know the style of their publication. What kind of, do they usually have things in chronological order? What kind of writing style do they typically follow? When the story is submitted to your editor, expect that he or she will contact you with revisions. So after you write the story, expect that you'll have to rewrite it. It's not a bad thing. It's often expected. They might just want you to add more information in a particular section. They might say this paragraph is too long. We now have less. You might have to adjust for size of copy because of ads. They might say that you begin this idea, but we need a little bit more information. And they would ask you to revise it in that sense. So it might need to be tweaked, and don't be upset or concerned if that happens to you. That's very standard. It happens in the publishing industry as far as books as well. So if freelance writing is something that you want to segue into fiction with, that's something to consider. To create your query letter, there are books about this. There's fantastic websites that often address this. These are based on my experience. Begin the first paragraph by detailing the hook. What will draw the reader in? Why should the editor care? That's essential. Explain that you're interested in writing the story, adding a few more details about length, what it will cover, and the section of the publication where it will appear. Showing, not telling, why it will fit. Now, again, you are not writing the story itself. You are selling the idea for the story. They are not expecting you to have that copy of the story there in their hands when you're selling it. List the section of the publication again, or the month that it would typically be written for. And know this first from your research, using either the editorial calendar, looking at back issues, everything we've talked about to this point. Demonstrate an understanding of the publication's reader. Who reads the magazine? What is the audience like? You can get some of that information from the circulation details and demographics in the media kit for a publication. Sometimes you can get an idea or a sense of it from the title. If it's a sports magazine, if it's a niche magazine like stamp collecting or crocheting, like obviously that's a pretty specific audience. If the topic lends itself to things like a sidebar or particular art or particular photographs, have an idea for those ready when you can put it into your query letter, or you can certainly talk to the editor about it. Thank the editor for his or her time if they respond by email or if they contact you by phone. Sometimes they do both. And once you send that letter out, expect that you have your material ready to respond to it in case they call you right away. And sometimes they might not call you for 2 weeks or a month. It really varies. You basically want to also explain that you would like to discuss the story in more detail in your thank you for taking the time to read the query. But again, remember that they might get back to you fairly quickly. Another thing to consider is keeping track of your query letters. The easiest way to do this today is setting up an Excel spreadsheet. Be sure to list the following information in your spreadsheet, because organization is key as a freelance writer. It's tough. You're your own boss, right? If you want to think about it as a job, part-time or full-time, and I've done both, you really need to stay organized. You don't want to try to sell the same idea to multiple different publications all at the same time when they're open, because what if they get picked up by both? How could you tweak the idea if that happens? You need to know who you sent, what, and when. So you would have a column that says the title of the story, including the title that you gave the story when you pitched it to the person, the editor. Then you would have a synopsis. So maybe like an elevator pitch of the story, if you will, 2 or 3 sentences, what you described to the editor. Publication name, where you sent it, the date that you sent it, the date it was accepted or rejected. That's important. Contact the publication, phone and email for that publication, so you have it handy quickly. If you get a phone call and they leave a message and you lost the number for it, definitely have that listed. And remember also the name of the person that you spoke with if they reach out to you, because you may reach out to them again in the future. Even if they rejected your work, hold on to that person's name, and then you realize, okay, well, they're the people that are looking at it. That's the person I can address my letter to. You can always call a publication and say you have an idea for a story and it's for a specific section. Who can I address my query letter to? And they might tell you. And again, you might have a publication like Outside that has exactly who they want you to address queries to and how long the query should be and what it should cover. So it's going to depend on where you want to sell your work. And finally, have a column blank for follow-up. Do you need to check in? Have you pitched a story and you haven't heard either way, anything back? Will you follow up in 2 weeks? Will you follow up in a month to see if they're interested? Or if they've rejected it, you can say it was rejected, but they said they'll keep my name on file for future freelance work. And you can always request that, especially as an undergraduate. Say, I appreciate it. I recognize this didn't fit your publication at this time. Thank you for considering it and for letting me know. And please keep my name on file for any future freelance possibilities. And believe it or not, people do. Occasionally people do. Now, not everyone does, not every publication will, but occasionally they do. And finally, something to consider is coping with rejection. This is part of the job. Freelance writers have to develop a thick skin. And it's hard as an undergraduate because especially if you've had work published and had great internship experiences, sometimes your work will be rejected. It's almost impossible to get it sold every time. If you do, my kudos to you, because that's something that most freelance writers talk about amongst themselves. I pitched to them, it was bad timing, or it didn't work, or I thought it was a great idea, but it might not have been right at the right time. Recognize that role of timing and what their intention and what's going on in their mind for their publication and where they're going with it, their vision for it, may not align with yours at that time. And it doesn't mean it's a bad idea or it's a bad piece. It just means that sometimes timing works against you. Ask the editor again to keep your name on file for future stories. Like spring training in baseball, keep on swinging. So look at that Excel spreadsheet, look at where you've pitched the story and try to pitch the same story or a variation of it to another publication along that same niche. Is there something else out there that might publish it? Read through back issues of the publication. Maybe you misread where they are trying to get a younger audience, an older audience, an audience from Berks County. There are so many different variations that could be faced. And consider how the story can be revised to fit, again, a different market or a different platform, and send out that new pitch and keep track of those pitches again on your spreadsheet. So again, I hope this helps you. I'm going to spend the rest of the session on any Q&A that you might have. If you have any questions, you can put them into chat now. You can always reach out to me at tmb26@psu.edu, and I'm happy to answer any questions I can about this. This, again, to wrap up, is just my experiences in how to get started as a freelance writer, some best practices to keep in mind, and telling you what worked for me in the hopes that something similar can work for you. So thank you for coming today.
Great chat, Tara. Thank you so much. It's super interesting because I can even remember as a college student how I was so fearful from letting other people read and give me feedback on what I wrote. That experience, that rejection is a very real thing, right? Because these are your thoughts and your ideas verbalized and put into writing, and that's got to be one of the most challenging pieces of being a freelance writer.
It is, and you get emotional, and sometimes editors want to change your baby, they want to change it, and you're like, oh, I put my heart and soul into this piece, and they want to change it, and how open am I to change it? And it's okay to tell them if, well, I could see reworking this, but I feel strongly about this. There's a little give and take, and yes, it's hard, and my students would know that I mark up their papers, so much to offer suggestions. So it's not that marking it up means that it's bad. It doesn't mean that. It means that it was good enough to get feedback from editors. It's a good thing when editors mark up your copy, because they tell you what worked and what needs work, and that tells you where to go from there so you can sell more work in the future.
That's a lot of vulnerability out there. So good for you. Good for you writers out there. Like that's having that kind of like skill set and that ability to incorporate, like to accept that feedback gracefully, incorporate that feedback, and then keep going through that process again and again is definitely an impressive thing. So thank you so much. I was actually sitting here thinking you had referenced at some point about how things operated pre-internet, right? And I was like, well, not completely pre-internet, but before there was this massive explosion into another dimension, essentially.
Right.
So I was wondering if you would share with us, like, what are your thoughts on that evolution that you have not only observed, but really been a part of since, we have this new digital age, and how have freelancers in that context, how have they evolved?
Well, I think that it provided more opportunity. I think that it was a little bit harder, that we were a little bit more used to doing detective work before, because the internet was around. I'm not that old. I know what you're saying, but people didn't use it that much. We didn't have access to it. We did not have smartphones. You would have to go, like, my campus library had internet access, but I didn't at my house or my apartment as an undergraduate at all. So it saved me a lot of time, I would say, as the internet had more opportunities for freelancers on it. There's also a lot of chatter, and sometimes there's are things that take you down different paths that you shouldn't go down. You should never pay to have your work published. As a freelance writer, never. If some site is saying, oh, we'll sell your stories if you pay us $30 a month, or really be skeptical of that. I would go directly to the source. I think that it is helpful, and I directed people in this talk to go to Writer's Digest, but now with websites being as developed in terms of mission and looking at back issues, I mean, you can find most of what you need by knowing what you want to do and going straight to the source on their website online.
That's super helpful. And I guess you mentioned that there's more opportunity, but there's also that expanded larger audience, right? So you're talking about basically you're increasing your competition, but you're also increasing the reach that you have, right?
That's true. You're increasing your reach, and that can be a good thing. But it also can mean that there's more competition as freelance writers. So you have to be aware of that too. As far as rejection, you have to have good game. You have to have a good style. You have to have no copy errors. You can't have misspellings. You have to have very clean copy. Editors look for people that have produced copy for them on the deadlines they set, at the word counts they set, and that you're open to listening to their thoughts and being flexible. So developing that relationship with an editor hasn't changed. I think it's more accessible through email and through chat and through Zoom than it has been than ever before. But I think that it's also important to remember the basics and remember that your work has to be quality work. And if it is, they'll come back to it.
Great. And actually, this is a really nice segue because throughout your presentation and even just through our recent discussion here at the end, you were mentioning some qualities, like what are good qualities for freelance writers to have? Because there might be somebody in our audience right now who's kind of teetering like, oh, should I do this? Should I do that? Maybe I should minor, maybe I should major. So like, what are some characteristics or qualities of successful freelance writers?
I would say curiosity, the willingness to go a little bit more in depth to understand what you're writing about, and not just skimming the surface. I think that curiosity is incredibly important. I think dedication to your writing craft, dedication to writing and producing, playing with different styles, being flexible in that way. It definitely helps to be organized. I've known freelance writers that aren't organized and they get by, but it's a lot harder because you're like, oh, where did I put that? And what did I, I think that you have to eventually, it's hard because you do get emotionally attached, but you eventually learn to gain that detachment from your work, that they're not criticizing me, they're criticizing the copy and they just want it to fit their voice. And my voice can come through. It's just, I might have to adapt parts of it to their style. So I think that, curiosity, determination, I think those are important qualities. I think that flexibility is important, and organization is definitely something that could help.
Great, thank you so much. And it's funny because like sitting here, I'm thinking about even when we went to the New York Times site during your presentation, like how much goes into what we're seeing, and timelines and personalities and back and forth. So it really is, like you had mentioned, like that give and take throughout the entire process. So thank you. Great answers. And I actually just have one more question that's a little off topic, but not completely. So you've been an instructor, professor with us for several years here at Penn State Berks. And I just thought it'd be nice for you to be able to share with your audience kind of what you like about Berks, what keeps you coming back, Tara, all those sorts of things. And if you want to, because I know that you're also our Common Read coordinator, you can tell us a little bit about that if you want.
Sure. I mean, I love the people. I really do. I think that we have such great instructors and staff here. I mean, they're fantastic. They're very committed to their students. I see them and hear them tell me how much they talk to students, online during a virtual pandemic and in person whenever they can when we go back. I think they're very supportive to their students through a process. I think that we have a huge advantage as a campus to have smaller classes than our University Park campus, which is fantastic as well. But some of those classes might be 500 people and you may not know your professor one-to-one and they don't get to know your work. Or you personally, or they may not be able to answer all of your questions. They might direct you to a TA. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you're looking for. But if you are looking for one-on-one experience with a professor to ask him or her about, assignments and different things like that, or if you have questions about financial aid or student support, people are so accessible at Penn State Berks. And I think that that comes across to the students that I talk to about their professors, about their, the people that they've sought help from when they needed it. So I think that's amazing. Our Common Read this year is grit. And I think that theme of resilience is really important. Usually the Common Read will change from year to year. Typically, sometimes we run it this year, we'll be doing grit again. It is something that developing skills that will help you strengthen your resilience during difficult times like a pandemic can be vital. So it's something that once students read as a campus, they can discuss amongst themselves or discuss with their instructors or peer mentors. And so that's something that can, those are just a few things that I like about Berks.
Professor Beecham, thank you so much. Like really great, thoughtful stuff. And I think Grit definitely would speak to those seeking opportunities in the freelance industry. And all of us, like we can all learn a little bit more, even with the repeat performance of Grit. It was great the first time around. I'm looking forward to the second. So I just want to thank you, Professor Beecham, for chatting with us today. There's certainly more spring in my step knowing now that there are accessible pathways to freelance writing. And I'd also like to send a special thank you to all of you in our audience for joining us today. And as you click out of the webinar, you're going to receive access to a survey. Please take a few minutes required to complete the survey to let us know what you thought about today's chat. And you can even offer some ideas for future chats as well at that time. You're encouraged to reach out to us via email, and we want to remind you to keep checking our website as we're always adding new chats. That is the truth. And actually, our next chat is Wednesday, March 24th at 12:15, where we're going to continue our Majorly Prepared series and get to learn about the PSU Berks IST and cybersecurity programs, where we can learn about applying technology to solve problems. That might also be interesting to the freelance population. So be sure to come back and meet with other faculty, staff, or students to learn about our exciting majors and experiences that you can be a part of here at Penn State Berks. So stay safe, Berks and beyond, and signing off until next time, this has been the Penn State Berks LionSide Chats.
Thank you, Sonia.
Oh, you did so great. Thank you for joining us today, okay? Stay safe. Thanks, and have a nice weekend.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.